And good afternoon and good evening, everybody. So, we're here to do a special stream to discuss the official Amazon Lord of the Rings synopsis. Hi, everybody. Corey Olsen, the Tolkien Professor here. I am joined today by Maggie Parke, Director of the Mythgard Institute. And we love talking adaptation stuff together. You may have heard us do we did discussions of the Tolkien film when it came out. And we've done some other discussions here lately. So I am. This is pretty interesting stuff. I wouldn't say there's anything shocking in the synopsis. I mean, it's pretty much confirming the fairly apparent conclusions that we had. I mean, like this. Oh hey, they're doing the Second Age. That's not exactly news right now because we've been seeing that it was clearly Second Age stuff. Whenever you release a map with Numenor on it, it's fairly clear where we're located, right? That's there aren't too many options there about that. So anyway, so that's where we are now. So Maggie, what are you thinking? What are your sort of general thoughts, reactions?
To be perfectly honest, my immediate reaction, which I think I put out straight on Twitter, was it just didn't tell us anything. And frankly,
right.
It could have described any high fantasy. We had an unlikely hero. We had a band of secrets that were going to fight against a big evil. Right. So I have to say, it wasn't really revealing.
No, it was not very revealing. Yeah.
I think upon digging it down, which I'm sure we're going to do in the next, however long we're here. Digging down, you can kind of infer more. So it was fun to kind of unpack it slowly, like all those mentions of locations and stuff. You can start to figure out what's going to be in that.
Right.
But you also have to assume that they were trying to engage an audience that has no knowledge of all of this Tolkien lore. So they kept it super broad and referred to things that they might know from Peter Jackson, but didn't refer to anything too specific to alienate anybody. So in its boringness, it was kind of effective.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's definitely effective, I think, as promotion, but truly for, Tolkien people who have been kind of poring over this and hoping for, juicy
and
details.
Dying for anything new.
Exactly. There's not so much that's very juicy. And yet it's nice to see some things actually confirmed, right? There was still some kind of chance that, like for instance, it was always conceivable that like the Second Age material was not going to really be the entire focus of the first season that's released. They could have done some kind of, I don't know, setup work, not like the Peter Jackson flashback at the beginning, but again, but now we know, it's definitely going to be, focused on the Second Age. Everything we can expect to be released is going to be focused on the Second Age, and that's something. That's definitely something.
Well, and even and just this bit, we've got 5 seasons, so it's entirely plausible that they're going to really slowly build up to things that we're more familiar with now. Yeah. But they're establishing that they're starting with something that we haven't seen yet.
Yeah, and it was one of the things that my assumption. And I don't know if you think this is a fair assumption. My assumption was that this synopsis basically covers the first season, right? That they're not giving a synopsis of the whole 5-season run.
I don't think they're at all organized for that yet.
Honestly, I would almost hope not, right? It's good to plan, but it would be kind of nice to, sort of let it grow a little bit organically, as they go. So, I think there's definitely something to be said for that. Now, Ray Burns points out very appropriately, the average viewer will be okay unless the average viewer is going to be expecting hobbits, right? Which is, yes. Though it's an interesting question to me, right? Because, of course, the ancient history of hobbits, we know very, very little. I mean, pre-Smeagol, we know very little about how, there's some, of course, couched in terms of speculation in the Concerning Hobbit section in the prologue of the Fellowship of the Ring. But the actual history, where really did hobbits come from? When did there begin to be creatures who could be called hobbits? How and when exactly did that happen? The only claim, in as much as it's a claim, is that the hobbits have been around for longer than the big people think. how long is that? You know, were they there in
Right.
this? Are there hobbits in the Second Age? I mean, you know,
And
especially, yeah, who knows?
and in terms of like adaptation, that's just enough of a nugget to be exciting, because in terms of rights, there's a lot of freedom with this adaptation to be able to play around, as long as they don't contradict anything that already exists in the Tolkien text.
Right.
So if there's not really a lot specifically about hobbits, they might run with that. They might create something and have this storyline about hobbits that maybe feeds into something we know from the more modern texts, but we haven't seen yet. So
Right.
who
Right.
knows?
Yeah, exactly. And the rule, just to explain, I mean, I don't know. Don't get me wrong. I don't know anything about the details of the agreement with that Amazon has. You know, we don't know what their rights encompass. That's one of the big mysteries about this whole thing. However, I can tell you a little bit about how these kinds of rights deals are generally articulated. And the way that that generally works is, if there is a character or a story that appears in a work that you have the rights to, but the main version of that story is in another work that you don't have the rights to, then you can't tell that story. So the clearest illustration of this, Beren and Luthien, both named in The Lord of the Rings, right? We get the whole Beren and Luthien story in Aragorn's poem. They come up in the narrative, of course, in the Stairs of Cirith Ungol conversation. So, you might be tempted to look at that and be like, well, hey, so technically, if you have the rights to The Lord of the Rings, you can do the Beren and Luthien story too. No, you cannot. Legally, you cannot, because the main version of the Beren and Luthien story is in the Silmarillion. So if you don't have Silmarillion rights, you can't even talk about Beren and Luthien, even though they are in the Lord of the Rings text. So that's the general way that these kind of rights agreements work. So one of the things, therefore, that's really interesting, with the confirmation of Numenor, like their use of the name Numenor, right, in the release. Clearly, they have the rights to Numenor. So what does that mean? Because obviously Numenor comes up throughout the Lord of the Rings, and yet where exactly does the primary version of the Numenor story lie, and what does that say? So one question that people have already asked me: does this suggest that they have complete or partial Silmarillion rights? Because, if you take the Akalabaith as the primary version of the Numenor story, then they would have to have the rights to that in order to tell the Numenor story, even though, again, the Numenor story is alluded to many, many, many times throughout the Lord of the Rings. But there are two things that I would say to that. First of all, of course, it is conceivable that they could have negotiated partial rights, like the rights to the Akalabaith, but not to the rest of the Silmarillion.
Right.
So just because, even if they did have Akalabaith rights, that doesn't necessarily prove that they have the whole thing. The second thing that I would say is, I think you could make a legal case that the primary story of the primary version of the Numenor story is not in the Akalabaith, but in Unfinished Tales. We get more Numenor material in Unfinished Tales, I would argue, at least as much as you get in the published Silmarillion. So conceivably, again, I don't know, depending on how it gets litigated, essentially, you could argue, if they had, and I don't know that they do have, but if they did have Unfinished Tales rights, which I would think would be easier to acquire than Silmarillion rights, if they had acquired Unfinished Tales rights, then they might, that by itself might give them all that they needed. Certainly, and this, the presence, the possibility of Unfinished Tales rights being included in the Amazon license, was suggested to me when they released the map, right? Because they use some of the names which only appear in Unfinished Tales in the map, and that it doesn't like prove that they have those rights, but it was really suggestive to me.
And it could depend on the contracts of those other documents too. So if Unfinished Tales or Silmarillion are with somebody else, then it could be in that somebody else's best interest to have Amazon do a little bit with it. So there could be, a secondary contract that says, yes, you can have access to this story, but we need to approve XYZ,
Yeah.
So there could be like another layer of protection. But,
yeah, exactly.
You can't say it's only Second Age because of this. It could span a little
Right.
bit farther than we
Right.
know.
Yeah, we just really don't know. I mean, the only thing that we know, the only fact that we know is that Amazon did negotiate a big new rights deal. That they're not just using the same rights deal, and that original rights deal has been, passed around and passed around. I mean, that has been used and reused so many times. I mean, not only the Peter Jack, like basic, like the Bakshi film, the Rankin Bass film, the Jackson films, Lord of the Rings Online, every other video game that's ever come out, all of that stuff is on the same rights deal, based on the same rights deal that was originally negotiated. So this was, from the beginning, this was always the biggest news about the Amazon project, was that they had negotiated a new deal. That's what cost all the money, right? I mean, people talk about how much how much money people, talk about, like, the $1 billion show. A lot of that, like half of that, was just in the new rights deal. And that's why that was such a big deal. Anyway, okay. So, let's see. Maddie, Ellen was asking, do we have any idea when this is supposed to begin airing? No, I haven't heard anything about that.
No, they've only said 2021. We don't know when.
We have the year.
We do know that the first 2 episodes have been filmed. So the first and second were filmed back to back, and they're done from what we can infer, at least the filming, the production element. I think they're about to start the rest of the season. I can't confirm that, but I feel like I read that they're in process of preparing for the rest of it. And I think they're filming seasons 1 and 2 back to back as well, which means that they would technically have the arc for 2 full seasons.
For 2 full seasons, sure. What would you, just based on your experience with these kinds of productions, what would you guess that would, I mean, if they're at around that stage of the filming, what would you, does that mean probably like fall, or like December of this year, or earlier?
There's kind of 2 factors there. Like, if they film them back to back and they're ready to go straight into post-production, then they could have them out by early summer. I mean, that is definitely feasible, especially if they're able to edit it together in sequence and get season 1 sorted before 2. So it is entirely possible we could see something early summer, but I think there's going to be a secondary consideration that is COVID and marketing.
Yeah.
So it's going to depend absolutely what, HBO Max is going to do with all of their Warner Brothers access, and what Disney Plus is doing with all of their launches, and if we're still locked down and everybody wants this massive premiere. I mean, we saw what happened with Wonder Woman and things like that. This is what Amazon wants. They want an event. Right. So I think they'll look at the release calendar as well, which is changing every week, depending on the state of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would guess it would be either summer or Christmas. Those are my guesstimates.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Ray points out, and merchandising as well. The other thing that has to be taken into account.
It is Amazon. They're going to tie that in.
Yeah, I'm sure. Good. So let's talk about the synopsis itself. It's short. I'll just read it, and then we can kind of, so we can get the whole picture, and then we'll kind of talk about it, sort of line by line. Okay. Amazon Studios' forthcoming series brings to screens for the very first time the heroic legends of the fabled Second Age of Middle-earth history. This epic drama is set thousands of years before the events of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, and will take viewers back to an era in which great powers were forged, kingdoms rose to glory and fell to ruin, unlikely heroes were tested, hope hung by the finest of threads, and the greatest villain that ever flowed from Tolkien's pen threatened to cover all the world in darkness. Well, one of the several times that hero threatened to cover all the world in darkness.
Details.
Yeah, he has a long career. This is what Sauron Mark II, I think that we're on here at this point. But okay. Anyway, beginning in a time of relative peace, the series follows an ensemble cast of characters, both familiar and new, as they confront the long-feared reemergence of evil to Middle-earth. From the darkest depths of the Misty Mountains, to the majestic forests of the elf capital of Lindon, to the breathtaking island kingdom of Numenor, to the furthest reaches of the map, these kingdoms and characters will carve out legacies that live on long after they are gone. There
I'm
we
so
go.
glad you read it like that because that's how I heard it in my head, which is
Yeah,
why I was underwhelmed.
I
Because it
wasn't
was like in
planning to
19,
do something very dramatic, but I can't help it. You know.
it was like a 1940s newsreel. It's like one day on the brink of devastation, you know. It just felt very like over the top.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's there. It
Okay,
is.
so should we take this? I feel like I need to prompt you for this because your knowledge is going to be way deeper, and I can just chime in with film bits. But yeah, do you want to just go through it line by line and see
Sure,
what
sure.
we?
Yeah, we've got some plot and location stuff, right? So we kind of broke it down here line by line. So Second Age of Middle Earth, right? Okay.
We
So
knew that.
now we knew that, but something just kind of struck me with the way that, it says right, brings to screens the heroic legends of the fabled Second Age of Middle Earth's history. What I was really interested in was I'm not saying that I think they're going to try to be comprehensive in their treatment of the Second Age, but it sounded a lot more comprehensive than I expected. Again, I wasn't necessarily just expecting like a Second Age preamble and then moving on, but there's a difference between saying we're going to take this one story from the Second Age and work that into, build an arc around that, and saying, we're going to bring the Second Age to screens. And even their whole, sweeping panorama sentence at the end, right, gives the sense of a desire for thoroughness that I wasn't necessarily expecting from them. I was thinking something a little bit more Anatar focused narrowly, like, to really kind of zoom in on Anatar and Celebrimbor and the Forging of the Rings of Power and sort of that story. The scope of that feels wider than I expected. Again, maybe I'm reading too much into that, but that's kind of what it sounded like to me.
Yeah, and the bit that I got from that was that all of a sudden it gave us something Googleable. So even if you weren't familiar with the series, you
Right.
could really quickly type in Second Age of Middle Earth and be like, oh, okay, and
Right.
there's enough fandoms that have built this out. We can see how that ties
Yeah.
to what we know. So
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
a good gateway.
Definitely. Okay, so we get right. Anyway, so sorry. Going back to the plot here. Okay, our line by line. So great powers were forged. That is a really.
And we do have a comment here from CJK who said, "Wasn't the ring forged in the Second Age?"
Yeah.
Indeed, an excellent reference to forging.
Yes. The forging word is conspicuous in that way, but of course, it's not only the Ring of Powers, right? To an era in which great powers were forged. Kingdoms rising to glory and falling to ruin. The falling to ruin I expected. The rising to glory surprised me a tiny bit, right? If we're gonna, so here's my question. A question that was not really on my radar screen at all. How much are we going to get about the rise of Numenor? And like the rise of Numenor? I mean, are we going to start with Elros in episode 1? I mean, is Elros going to appear on screen? I would have said no a week ago, that we wouldn't start.
And now.
Yeah, and now maybe.
But that could also just be a marketing thing of like, we're talking about ruin, we better talk about glory, so it could just be a bookend thing. But the fact that it's at least referenced, and we know it starts in a time of peace, so that infers that we've got some glorious beginning, and we're going to assume a happy ending to get us into season 2, that there should be some moments of glory in there.
Yeah. Chatting Myth was asking prospects of a flashback arc of the Eärendil journey. See, now this is actually from a legal standpoint. I wouldn't want to be the person who had to litigate the Eärendil story, because let me ask you this question: where is the primary version of the Eärendil story? Answer: Tolkien never wrote one. Like, it doesn't exist. So I would argue that actually the Bilbo's poem, I mean, like, it's kind of, you could make an argument that Bilbo's poem is now, I think the prose synopsis that we get in the Silmarillion would probably be adjudicated to be the major one. So we probably won't get Eärendil, certainly not depicted, the whole story depicted on screen like that. But the primary text of the Eärendil story is sort of a sore point personally, because it's like the story he never actually told. Yeah. But, okay. So Lost
So
my
we've
train of
got
thought.
epic drama, thousand
Epic
years
drama, thousands of
before.
years. Oh yeah, the rise of kingdoms, the
Great
rise and
powers
fall of kingdoms.
forged. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So how much Numenor again? And I'm not suspecting they're gonna, because I mean, to be perfectly frank, the first couple thousand years of Numenor are quite uneventful, right? You know, like what are they going to depict there, right? But it is kind of interesting to think about. Falling to ruin. We've got plural kingdoms falling to ruin. My biggest question, and honestly, this was the if there was anything new that I can't say took from it, but again, kind of suspected. I found myself, instead of drawing conclusions, I found myself asking new questions, basically, as a result of this synopsis primarily. And one of the new questions that I found myself asking was, are we even going to get to the Last Alliance in season 1? I'm no longer sure. I would have guessed for sure that was going to be, like we were going to start with like the forging of the Rings of Power with Celebrimbor and Anatar and Eldarion from Numenor, right? And Eldarion and Gilgalad being like darkness is rising in Middle Earth, and then Celebrimbor and Sauron making the Rings of Power, and then the war, and then and we can do Numenor, right? And then the Last Alliance, basically do a Second Age arc. I am no longer confident. That might be season 2. I mean, we could really end season 1 with like the war with Sauron and Gilgalad, basically, with where Elrond was besieged in Rivendell, and Sauron is marching with Celebrimbor's corpse hanging from a pole, like that would be like those would be the climactic events then of the end of season 1, and then the whole downfall of Numenor story, culminating in the perhaps in the War of the Last Alliance, with the return of Elendil and his alliance with Gilgalad, who would have been well established from season 1, and then culminating with the death of Gilgalad and Elendil and the downfall of Sauron, could then be the arc of season 2.
And we don't know what else they're picking up. So, I mean, it could be that the Alliance could be the end of season 4 for all we know. I mean, who knows which track they're going to pick up and how much artistic flexibility they're going to have. We can't assume that they have the same bank of knowledge that you have in your brain. So we have to hope that they do. But
I'm sure I'm not overly skeptical of their lore resources, but
it's just how much attention they want to put on it, because
how much story they think they can make out of it, and how much
they take the outline of a story, but then they go off on a tangent that they have total artistic freedom with. So we just have to see where they go with that direction.
And we do have some evidence of completely new storylines for which they will have complete creative freedom, or almost complete creative freedom. That was one of the things that particularly perked me up there in that description. But hang on, so there's lots of questions coming in, so I'm trying to sort of sort some things here. Okay, so just to clarify, Daniel, good question. The book ends of the Second Age, right? So when we're talking about the Second Age, what we're talking about is, so the First Age ends with the fall of Morgoth, right? The fall of Morgoth and the breaking of Thangorodrim, that's the end of the First Age. So from, when we're cleaning house, in Middle Earth after the war of Wrath, that's the beginning of the Second Age. But basically the beginning of the, so like what events happened at the very beginning of the Second Age? The founding of Numenor is pretty close to the like very beginning of the Second Age. It's like the first, apart from like, and then the good guys went home back to Elvenhome and Valinor, right? It is kind of the very first thing that happens in the Second Age. But the establishment of Numenor is really kind of the headliner of the beginning of the Second Age. Then the bookend is the fall of Sauron, the War of the Last Alliance. I know that in my own head, I often tend to think of the downfall of Numenor as the end of the Second Age. I mean, I kind of like identify the Second Age with Numenor, basically. Like the beginning of Numenor is the beginning and the end of Numenor is the end, but it's not. It's the Battle of the Last Alliance. So all that stuff that happens after, I say all that stuff. The War of the Last Alliance is the stuff that I'm talking about. The arrival of the Numenorian exiles in Middle Earth, and then the teaming up with Gilgalad and the war against Sauron. The Battle of Dagorlad and all that stuff. That's it's still in the Second Age. So the Third Age doesn't begin until after Elendil and Gilgalad are dead. Anyway, so that's those are the technical
The
framework there, and the fact that they have identified the second age explicitly means we're certainly going to be in there. S. Yeager, yes, a younger Treebeard would be both funny and awesome. You are correct on both counts, and of course he's totally there. I mean, we know he was there in the first age. He says as much in the song that he sings. Like the unpopular song that Treebeard gives us a couple songs, right? He gives us his awesome marching song, which is great. And he gives us his famous Ent and Entwife song, which everybody's interested in because everybody loves the Entwives. And then there's that other song that he sings.
This one.
The In the Willow Meads of Tessaranen song, which is a complete perplexity to people who have only read The Lord of the Rings, because the entire poem is just chock full of proper nouns from the Silmarillion, which, remember, hadn't been published at the time. So like the entire first generation of readers of The Lord of the Rings were reading this poem and being like, I haven't the faintest idea what Treebeard is talking about here. But those are all Beleriand points of interest. So we know Treebeard was there. So Treebeard, no question, is going to be there.
And that's an easy, pleasant nod to the familiar, so it's comedic relief. It's an excellent way to get a story from point A to point B, to bring in somebody that can help move that forward that we know. That's a no-brainer on my side from production.
Yeah. No, I think we're gonna have that. I'll be disappointed if we don't get a Tom Bombadil cameo. To be perfectly frank, not only because like he's obviously there, but because this is stuff is happening in his backyard. I mean, the war is in Eriador, right? I mean, it's not like he's not going to be part of the War of the Last Alliance, right? But when Sauron invades Eriador, I mean, Tom Bombadil. He's going to be.
And there's still a
nearby.
lot of hurt feelings from Bombadil not being included in Peter Jackson's adaptation. So again, a nice way to like a little nod to the fans. All right, here's your buddy. We'll put him in.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, man, so many good questions.
I know.
I hope they will show some Carn Dûm and the Witch King. Yep, I agree, but not this season. That's a third age thing. So much of this is one of the things that kind of can sort of blow your mind, actually, when you're kind of going through this stuff. The Second Age was a long time ago, right? The Second Age, the events of this show, they said thousands of years, 4,000 to 5,000 years before the events. Wrap your head around that for a second. 5,000 years before the War of the Ring, we're going to be getting events in this show. Most of the events that you're accustomed as a Lord of the Rings reader to think of as ancient history are way later than this, right? Yeah. People say, oh, are they going to include the Blue Wizards? Maybe someday, but we're millennia before the wizards arrive in Middle-earth. They're a Third Age phenomenon. Again, the Witch King, Angmar, yeah, that's ancient history. That's like more than 1,000 years ago by the time, but it's the distant future from the perspective of this. So there are a lot of things that are going to be that you would imagine that we're not going to get, basically.
We've got one comment here. So 1,000 years per season. I'd be real surprised if they did that, though, because that doesn't give us any time to bond with the cast that they're establishing, and it really sounds like they want us on board with this fellowship. So
right. Well, there are some characters that we can, like Gilgalad is around for multiple millennia, right? So the elves are convenient that way. We can get lots of Elrond and lots of Gilgalad. In fact, right. The Gilgalad and Elrond like buddy cop thing I'm really looking forward to, right? I mean, Elrond and Gilgalad were like partners for, Elrond was was Riker to Gilgalad's Picard for like 3,500 years.
Think about the unspoken communication they'd have by that point. We would just eat it up on screen.
Absolutely. So that's going to be really fun. I'm really looking forward to that.
There's shorthand back and forth. There's so many fun things you could do with that. It's like that long of a relationship.
Yeah. No, it's gonna be fun. Okay, so let's see. we talked about rising to glory and fall. Oh no, there's something I want to say about falling to ruin. Okay, I better hurry up, and we can't talk about everything for 45 minutes. Multiple kingdoms falling to ruin. Is going to be interesting. I mean, and I think my suspicion is that what we are alluding to there is certainly Eregion, right? Celebrimbor's kingdom is going to be the number one kingdom, which is certainly going to fall to ruin during the course of season 1. I think that's our number one kingdom most likely to fall to ruin during season 1 is Eregion. Is Numenor going to fall to ruin during season 1? I wonder. It could, but that could, as we said, potentially be a season 2 thing. Even Sauron's own kingdom is going to fall to ruin a couple times. They could be referring to some of that stuff too. Okay, but anyway, so moving on. The greatest villain threatening to cover the world. I skipped one.
Before that, I'm like, we should definitely focus on just the villain. But the fact that there's unlikely heroes and hope hung by the finest, to me, that was just a marketing thing of like, yep, we've got unlikely heroes and we're going to be stressed out and hope hangs. But they still use the words unlikely hero and hope. So like those are both like such emotive words in terms of prompting reaction and engagement. I was like, okay, yep. But then that next bit, the greatest villain, that sparked some conversation now, didn't it?
Depends on how you take the word greatest, right? If you take greatest from a literary perspective, sure. Okay, yeah. No, I agree. I would agree with the premise that Sauron is a greater villain than Morgoth from a literary standpoint. Yeah, better known, better developed. Absolutely. Obviously, greatest in absolute value is nonsense, right? That's just a ridiculous thing to say. But I'm not gonna hang on
bend over backwards for
that kind of thing. By the way, on the subject of probably resisting the temptation to read too far into things, the juxtaposition of unlikely heroes and hope, of course, immediately gets me thinking about Aragorn and Estelle. And, let me say it this way. I like to think that they are actually thinking about that and like sowing seeds, for like the future. Obviously, Aragorn is not going to be in this series, right? Or, in this season. But it is equally obvious that any Tolkien fan, any Lord of the Rings fan is going to know that Aragorn is the culmination of the Numenor arc, right? And it's one of the things in the Film project, in our adaptation discussion that we've been having for years, one of the things that we often talk about is playing the long game, right? When we're talking about depicting stuff back in the first age, which is of course what we're talking about in the Film project, we often think about like wanting to stage things in exactly such a way as to anticipate the famous Lord of the Rings scene, which is like it. So, I mean, there's no question that in the minds of Tolkien fans watching this, Aragorn is not going to be in the show, but he is going to be like the looming presence, which is in the wings, which is being anticipated by all of these things. I mean, he's not the only one, but he's a major figure. So, with that...
And I remember talking to fellow Tro game designers, and they were saying the same thing. We don't mind if it references something you're familiar with from the films. So there's already that kind of, and when you say unlikely hero, I mean, to me that in like next to that definition in the dictionary is Bilbo and Frodo. So even if they don't touch into the hobbits, we have this kind of understanding of what they're referring to. So that reference, that like understanding, great. That only serves us to engage with the story and say, I can relate to this hero. Great.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Autoflagellator, you're absolutely correct that Aragorn's sword might make an appearance, and I certainly will be deeply disappointed if our attention is not drawn to Narsil during the show, as it will certainly be around. Absolutely. Okay, so
we talked about relative peace. We talked about characters familiar and new.
Yep.
Confront the long-feared re-emergence of evil to Middle-earth. We wouldn't have much of a story if there wasn't some evil to threaten.
Yes. And
then we get into the geography.
One last touch on long-feared re-emergence. that seems to me a fairly clear reference to, and here I'm thinking about the story in the short story Aldarion and Arendis in Unfinished Tales, where Aldarion, who is the crown prince of Numenor, essentially, is interacting with Gilgalad, right? He's both corresponding with Gilgalad and he's visiting Gilgalad. He's the first of the Numenorian ship kings, and Gilgalad is warning of, that there is a shadow that is growing in Middle-earth. Like the long-feared reemergence of evil is exactly the tenor. That is precisely the tenor of what Gilgalad, with his right-hand man, Elrond, are perceiving and are kind of working against in Middle-earth. So that's, I would still predict that the very beginning, like episode 1, is likely to be in the context of Aldarion, the visits of Aldarion, the Numenorian prince, to Gilgalad and Elendil in Lindon, and their discussion of the long-feared reemergence of evil, the shadow that is growing in the land, and they don't know what it is, but they're afraid that it might be, and that this is because remember, Sauron was a lieutenant under Morgoth. I mean, he was famous in the First Age, but he wasn't like the headliner, obviously.
He wasn't the general. Yeah.
Right. So that a shadow is growing is something which Gilgalad apparently can in some sense perceive. Who it is, what it is not going to be a no-brainer. I mean, so we shouldn't have people like Gilgalad being like, everyone being like, it is what we feared. Sauron is arising again. Like, they might say that. Why would they say that? Like, that's not a thing yet. Like, Sauron, this is Sauron arising for the first time. I mean, it's still his first comeback because he was there before and got beat up. But he's never been the power before, right? This would be the first time that he's really establishing himself as the power.
You'd still have people that don't know who he is and would be asking that question, who's this guy? So there's going to be a reestablishment of what we think we know of Sauron. We're going to have, I imagine, an insight into the character behind that, and it won't just start off as evil. I hope there's some humanity put into that, so we see a little bit more of a dynamic character that then ends up being the Sauron that we're familiar with.
Yeah. I have to confess to kind of hoping that somebody, when people find out or start theorizing that it might be Sauron arising, that somebody says something along the lines of, isn't he the guy who got beat up by that girl and her dog? But we'll see. We'll see. They would know Sauron as that guy who killed Finrod, Phil. That's a really good point. Certainly likely to be a major kind of touch point for Sauron's history for most of the folks. Will we see more of Sauron as Anatar? Oh, Anatar, yes. I expect Sauron to be an Anatar, guys, for the first time. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the turn, right, from I am Anatar, the giver of gifts, to Celebrimbor becomes aware of the forging of the One Ring, and Sauron drops his fair seeming and is now becomes Sauron the Dark Lord, and now declares himself the Lord of Middle-earth, and march that's would be a major dramatic turning point in the center of the season's arc. Is something that I could easily see. We'll see. Okay, but anyway, locations, geography. You wanted to go on to geography, which is a good idea.
I never want to rush you, but I also know that you've got a few minutes left.
I do, yeah. I've got an end point here. Yep. Okay.
And the geography is really telling, so we should dig into this a little bit.
Yes, definitely.
Start with the first one, So we've got darkest depths of the Misty Mountains.
So Khazad-dûm, obviously. I mean, there really can't be anything else that we're talking about. And darkest depths? Really, like the darkest ones. So we're talking Balrog here?
That's what I'm hoping. We've only seen one, right?
Yeah. I mean, it could just be that they're referring to Moria in general when they're talking about, but I mean, We're not just talking about the dark depths. No. These are the darkest depths of the Misty Mountains. And we know who lives in the darkest depths of the Misty Mountains. Okay, that's true. As Phil points out, nameless things gnaw the darkest depths of the Misty Mountains. But I should have said, you know the headliner who lives in the darkest depths of the Misty Mountains, and it's clearly the Balrog.
And yes, there's probably many other things that are nameless that we're going to see as well, leading up to the big bad that we do know.
Yes. And yeah, I know Yomaki and I agree. Heading to the Balrog already seems hasty. I mean, the delving too greedily and too deep, that's a Third Age thing. Again, that doesn't happen in the Second Age. The kingdom of Khazad-dûm stands through the Second Age. So maybe not, but it's possible.
Or they establish it early and the payoff is later. You know, we could just have an illusion that there's something terrifying.
Right. Or they bring out the Balrog a couple millennia sooner. That's not impossible.
Yeah.
That's not impossible. That's the kind of thing that I know Tolkien fans don't want to hear, but can I imagine that as a kind of creative license that they choose to take? Yeah, the shifting around the chronological time frame. I mean, I got to be honest, in my mind, that's a relatively tame kind of change to be making.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things we should probably just prepare ourselves for. It's not going to be a specific timeline that we're following. It's going to be a new story told in a different way. So we're going to have to speed a few things up, slow a few things down, move a few things around, so the same tone and the same action comes across that we get from the story.
Right.
And the way to do that is to bring things in from different spots.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, honestly, the primary role, it's not that it's shocking that they're going to bring Khazad-dûm in at all, because, I mean, hey, like, showing Khazad-dûm in its glory on the screen, yes, please, like, that sounds great, but, of course, it's the proximity to Eregion, right? I mean, we know that there were close relationships between the Noldor in Eregion and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, as evidenced, of course, by the Gates of Moria. So they were obviously going to be there, but the fact that we're listing that as a location, I mean, it could just be a curiosity, but it sounds like it's gonna there's going to be a story. There's going to be a Khazad-dûm plot line, basically, and I will be interested because honestly, apart from the Balrog, there aren't that many narratives, like stories about what happened in Khazad-dûm. We don't have many stories. I mean, we know the fact that they were friends with Eregion, but what does that mean? We know in one version of the stuff in Unfinished, of the Galadriel stuff in Unfinished Tales, that she was friends with the dwarves of Moria as well. But again, those aren't narratives so much as, you know, nuggets, concepts.
But we do know that there's centuries of life there, so there's a lot of rich fodder to build.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, you know, they easily could make some interesting stories. And of course, like, how did the fall of Celebrimbor and what was the reaction of the dwarves to, you know, the forging of the Rings of Power, you know, to the forging of the Ring of Power, to Anatar, right? You know, how did he get on with the dwarves? Were they uneasy about it? There's a lot of story to build out there. And I think that would be interesting. Phil suspects they will use whatever version of the story bigs up Galadriel for sure. I mean, she's a major character, obviously, you know, a major, you know, kind of narrative node in the history of Middle Earth, right? Very, very familiar to Lord of the Rings readers. So,
and has definitely been one of the casting decisions that they've promoted quite strongly. So we can assume that they're going to be using her pretty heavily.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so Moria stuff. The majestic forests of the elf capital of Lindon. Well, okay, so Gil-galad. That one was a no-brainer, but lovely to see that. The reference to the fact that it's not only the great city of Lindon, you know, the great, you know, but the elf capital, right?
Elf capital
Points directly to the High King, Gil-galad. And honestly, if I had to put you know, like a short list of things I am most excited about for this show, one of them would certainly be the development of the character of Gil-galad. I mean, he is, with the possible exception of Arendelle, whose story is never fully told, as I said, Gil-galad is one of the characters with the longest, most interesting story that Tolkien never tells at all, right? I mean, he is never more, in the narratives Tolkien wrote, Gil-galad is never more than a bit part, sometimes just an illusion, right? And yet, when you actually kind of map out the history of especially the second and third ages of Middle-earth, and not even just especially, including the first age of Middle-earth, he is not just the last of the High Kings of the Noldor, he's the greatest of the High Kings of the Noldor. I mean, I'm sorry, Fingolfin's rule as High King of the Noldor was eventful, and Fingolfin is awesome. But his rule was a flash in the pan compared to Gil-galad's. Gil-galad rules for almost 10 times as long as Fingolfin ruled. I mean, it's crazy. So, you know, he takes, when does he take over kingship? Bjarnasonar asks. He takes over kingship after the death of Turgon, the fall of Gondolin. So from the fall of Gondolin through the War of the Last Alliance, Gil-galad is the High King through the entirety of the Second Age of Middle-earth. And he's not only there, you know, he's not just marking time during those millennia as High King, he's acting as High King in Middle-earth. One of the lines, again, it's one of those very brief passages that, you know, one of these classic Tolkien Gil-galad passages where we get a reference and a glimpse of a story, but no substance of narrative, right? Is in the Akallabeth when Sauron returns after the whole Numenor thing, which was, you know, kind of win-loss situation for Sauron. Anyway, when he gets back to Middle-earth, right, there's this one clause in which Tolkien says, and when he returned to Middle-earth, Sauron found that the power of Gil-galad had greatly increased in his absence. What does that mean? What was Gil-galad doing? How does his power increase? Does he get more allies? Right? Does he he's been doing stuff. He's been what exactly is he doing? And in conjunction with whom? I've got to think he's laying the foundations of the Last Alliance, right? So when Elendil comes along, Gil-galad says, you know, I got the ponies, right? Let's saddle them up and let's head out. I've been spending the last millennium, you know, arranging this network of folks to resist the rise of the shadow. So he's up to a lot. He does a lot of things. And yet again, we don't have any narrative. Like there isn't a single contiguous paragraph of Gil-galad narrative in the entire corpus of Tolkien. So Gil-galad, yeah, by all means, take me to the majestic forest of the elf capital of Lindon. I am keen to see that.
And again, coming at this from, you know, a side where like a load of people are not going to know all this detail, and Amazon wants a huge audience. So even just like the basics, that sentence infers to us that these are not just pretty elves that live in the woods. This is a capital that has a structure, that has a government, that has purpose. And we can imagine the armies, we can imagine the structures, and that lends itself, I think, to just digging in a little bit deeper.
And
so
which
all
stands
of those
for
like simple
10
lines give depth, but we know, you know, the real depth under that they have access to build. Absolutely.
Right. And that capital stands for 10 times as long as Gondolin stands. I mean, seriously, that's what I mean, that Gil-galad's capital at Lindon, longest standing center of elvish power in Middle-earth, in the history of Middle-earth. I mean, he's such a big deal. He's such a big deal.
Yeah.
The breathtaking island kingdom of Numenor. Well, yes, you know, and to me, the real, but again, thank you for confirming. The real question to me is, how central is Numenor going to be? Are we going to get, you know, my immediate guess would be that there will certainly be Numenorian characters. I would guess particularly Eldarion, and Eldarion, as I said, he's going to be, I think, a very important figure there. But it could well be just like Numenorians in Middle-earth, and then like the occasional trip back, or like, you know, Eldarion brings the letter of Gil-galad back to his father, the king, right? And so we get the, you know, the panoramic tour through, through Numenor as he goes. Is that what we're going to get from Numenor? Or are there going to be whole like episodes which take place in Numenor? Are we going to get whole plot arcs and character development of minor Numenorians? Like that I don't know. That's one of the things I really wonder.
I think we're going to spend a lot of time. I mean, if it were me, I would spend a lot of time in each of these worlds. So
Right.
we want to see, the detail, the depth, the history, the culture, all of the social mores. So when they start to come together, we understand the clashes really strongly.
Yes.
So yeah, I think we're going to spend a fair bit of time in each of these. And the word breathtaking, I thought was quite markety, where they're like,
Yeah.
it's going to be stunning,
Yes.
so it's enough to like keep you engaged and
The
just
fabulous
wonder.
island kingdom of
Yeah.
Numenor. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so,
That's
then we get to what I find the most interesting phrase in the entire synopsis: the furthest reaches
furthest
of the map.
reaches of
Now, the furthest reaches of the map. Let's look at the map. What are the furthest reaches of the map? So I'm gonna just assume that we're talking about this map, right? Because that's
the
they
map
started by
that
releasing
Lord
the
of the
map.
Rings Amazon put out that
Exactly.
teased us all those months
So
ago.
furthest reaches, right? I obviously we're not talking about Linden, right? Linden and Eriador, which is going to be has to be the primary theater of action, is on the one hand, from the point of view of Middle Earth, it's a furthest reach, right? But it's obviously not the furthest reaches that we're talking about, because that's the central thing, right? Numenor, of course, is kind of furthest reach of this map too. It's way down in the bottom corner, but again, obviously that's been listed separately, so we're not talking about either. So Rhûn and Hard are the only thing that are left, right? And this, of course, draws attention to the fact that something which we observed at the time, but we didn't really know what to say about, which is all of this blank space down here in the bottom right-hand corner of this map, right? I mean, on the one hand, you could say, well, they had to include that in order to squeeze Numenor into the picture, because Numenor is, down like close to the equator, right? So, in order to squeeze it. But you could have put it in a box if you didn't want to include. Like, there are more efficient ways to do that than to include.
And we just get that one little reference to Umbar, and we get all this space.
Empty space. And notice the one thing that appears in the middle of the empty space: an arrow.
A giant fish.
Well, okay, a giant fish. No, not that empty space. Over here.
Oh yeah.
Right. There's the road that comes down, and this is the road. You'll notice this is the road that goes through Ithilien, right, and heads down to, and then we just get an arrow pointing in the direction of the empty spot, the big empty spot, which is like a third of the map, right? Personally, my suspicion is that that's what we're going to get. Now, what are we going to get there? I have no idea. But here's the one thing that I would say about that. We know that Sauron has a job of work putting his armies together, right? Especially since, remember, this is Sauron as boss man Mark I, right? This is the first time Sauron has ever arisen before. He was operative in the first age, but this is the first time he's ever arisen as the big bad, right? So he doesn't have armies he can just whip up. He's got to build that. And building that is going to require a couple things. It's going to require getting control of the existing orc populations that remain in Middle-earth, and it's going to require forging relationships of a peculiar sort with the men that we know are going to be in his armies, in Khan and Harad and Rhûn. The Easterlings and the Haradrim are going to join Sauron, but again, this is not just like, he's not just putting up Uncle Sam posters around Harad, right? Recruiting for his army. He's just hire mercenaries, right? This is a process. And Tolkien talked about this, actually. Again, I know, are they going to do this kind of thing? I don't know. But when Tolkien talked about this, he talked about the process of moral corruption. Think about the process in Numenor, right? How he takes them from where they are to human sacrifice, slavery and human sacrifices, right? That same kind of corruptive process. Tolkien talked about the process that Sauron would have had to go through in order to build a human army that's willing to come up, stand shoulder to shoulder with an orc army and be like, yeah, we're a team. us and the orcs, we're all in this together, right? You have to bring, you can't just have starry-eyed recruits who, believe that they're really the good guys, right? There's a process here. So if I had to guess what exactly we are going to see in the farthest reaches of in the farthest reaches of the map, it's going to be the process of Sauron building his armies. The answer to the question, how do the Haradrim and the Easterlings fall under Sauron's control in the first place?
Yeah.
That's what's happening. This is the first place.
Right. And when you say process, I mean, really, that's political propaganda, know? So like that is just going to be pretty fascinating.
And cult worship. They worship him as a god, right? So he's got to build his own cult of Sauron, right? So, so he's got to come in. So it's going to be a process of religious conversion to a sketchy cult, which is probably going to involve things like human sacrifice. At least that's part of the the operation he runs in Numenor, as we see, right? So yeah, a combination of propaganda and cult conversion and stuff like that. That's if I had to guess, because we know literally nothing about what was happening in Rhûn and about Rhûn and Hara during the Second Age. We know nothing. Oh, okay, no. The only thing we know, and we know it indirectly, is that they were fighting with Sauron, right? But again, that doesn't just happen magically. It doesn't happen overnight. So that would be my guess.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think that was most of the things. Kingdoms
and then
the carving out legacies
that live on.
Yeah,
we knew that would be there.
of course.
It's all going to tie into what you all know and love.
Right, yes. And don't worry, we haven't forgotten the Lord of the Rings plot and the fact that we need to get around to that. Yeah. That a Lord of the Rings show should probably also include, the Lord of the Rings narrative. Don't worry, we're going to get there. Yes. So, yeah, I think that we kind of skimmed over briefly the reference to characters new and old, right? I mean, obviously they're going to be making up some of their own character, which should happen. I mean, it should happen. Tolkien is, to state it lightly, far from exhaustive in his character lists, right? When he gives the very sketchy overview, even the Akalabeth is a very sketchy overview of the whole narrative of Numenor and the Second Age, right?
Well, again, we have such a general thing to refer to. It's just like amazing creative fodder for these people to just pull what they want and make these storylines up, basically, within the world we know and with the approval of Tolkien estate and everything. But they got a lot of creative freedom.
Exactly. So several people are talking about the backstories, basically, the origin stories of the Nazgul, which absolutely, yes. Do I expect that to happen? I do expect that. Now, it's way too early. Way too early. We're millennia before the dudes, the 9 kings who are going to be corrupted by the 9 rings. Maybe not. I mean, I don't know. It'll be interesting. I do think that we are going to get, we could get some of that. And I think that we're certainly going to set some of that stuff up at the very least. So yeah. Will we get Kamal the Easterling? Very likely. Are we going to get the Black Numenorians and what's the backstory there? I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the emphasis, especially on the furthest reaches of the map stories, really do work towards the backstories of the backstories of the Nazgul, like in that direction. That does seem to me be and yes, the Mouth of Sauron, absolutely. Now again, Mouth of Sauron, mortal dude, not going to be born for thousands of years. But like what they can do, the wonderful opportunity of doing the long version story in this way is that they're going to be able to build to anticipate that stuff, right? They're going to be able to anticipate that stuff so that when we get the Mouth of Sauron, we're going to like understand his context in certain ways that, what we're told about him in the Lord of the Rings barely provides, right? We'll have what he wears will be able to signal things to us, right? If we see the rise of the cult of Sauron and the backstory of, if we see the culture of Harad go from, thriving independent culture to coming under the dominion of Sauron and the shadow falling over it, and it's becoming corrupted in various ways and ruled over by Sauron as dictator, god king. Then the very clothing that he wears will evoke for us memories of what happened in these things. So I think it's pretty cool.
I liked how focused on the literature this statement was. I feel like they knew the fans were more hungry for any information than anything else.
Yes.
Because there's so many references to things from the text that, the layperson wouldn't necessarily engage with. But it was general enough to just kind of be exciting. I'm a little concerned that they didn't stray enough away from any kind of references to Game of Thrones that people are just going to keep beating that dead horse of, it's just going to be just like it. But we have to just kind of compartmentalize and be like, this is the content we have. This is what we know, which isn't much. So let's be optimistic and play around with it a bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. The one thing I was glad about is that, so the sentence that you were alluding to before, clearly the most Game of Thronesy bit of this synopsis, right, is the great powers were forged, kingdoms rose to glory and fell to ruin, unlikely heroes were tested. Like, that sentence is the most and that's the, like, did you like Game of Thrones? You'll like this too sentence, clearly, right? But they did not include things like shocking betrayals or, like anything that suggested we're going to do the same kind of like devious political drama that you really loved in Game of Thrones.
Or romance.
Lost
or all
romance.
those other things,
right. Exactly. Yeah.
They're really focusing on like almost the political side of it and the rise to power and these really relatable characters and unlikely heroes. That's the bit they're playing on.
Right. And even hope hung by the finest of threads. Hope is not a very Game of Thronesy concept. It's just not. Right. I mean, there are many words I associate with George R.R. Martin's world. Hope is not one of them.
Hope is not one of them.
So again, it for those Tolkien fans who are worried about the whole Game of Thrones thing, I do not see support for the idea that they're just going to do Game of Thrones dressed up in Tolkien, cosplay in this series. I don't see evidence of that. Again, I clearly do see evidence of them attempting to appeal to that audience, no question. But
sure.
I
mean, they're both
like
fantasy. It'd be a disservice if they didn't try to appeal to the same fan base, but they're also setting themselves apart. And hopefully, as we start to see imagery and content come out of this, we'll get a little bit more confirmation of that.
Yeah.
That it is in a different class and category.
Yeah, definitely. And Bjarnasonar is correct. It's the heroes. Unlikely heroes is not a very Game of Thronesy concept either, really. No. So there are a couple pointers which seem to point in a non-George R.R. Martin direction, which is kind of nice. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, I should wrap up. I am over my time here.
Late.
Yeah, I'm late, but it's all right.
We do.
Anyway,
we'll do it again.
This was cool. Yeah, we'll see, what more we learn. It'll be interesting to learn a timeline when they have one as to when we can anticipate it. But of course, I'm really excited to see the first images, other than the map image, of course. But anyway, that's... I'm sure there will be more stuff. So Maggie, thank you for joining me. I always appreciate your take, and you know so much more about the film and adaptation end of things than I do. It's always really wonderful to get your perspective on this. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks. I love just sitting back and listening to you talk about it and go, ooh, I hadn't thought about that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for joining us. And stick around, pay attention. We'll be popping up and every now and again for stuff like this when things come out. So thanks everybody, and we'll see where I got Film coming up tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern time. If you want to talk about our theoretical adaptation there. So stuff coming on later this evening. Thanks everybody, and I'll see you guys around. Bye now.